You are a mechanical keyboard generation. This company doesn't need old-fashioned people like you. If the company doesn't need people like me, let's see if it can last 5 minutes.
1 second, I was running a routine systems check in the operations center. The next, I heard the unmistakable sound of entitlement walking in polished shoes, shallow confidence, and a voice already winding up to insult somebody. Dylan Carver, 26, freshly promoted by his last name rather than his resume. Leaned his shoulder against the server rack like it was built for him. "You know, Jonathan," he said, smirking as if he'd rehearsed it in the mirror, "this whole old-school engineer vibe of yours, it's dated. Maybe it's time the company upgrades from people who still worship mechanical keyboards." His words slid across the room with all the subtlety of a dropped wrench. I didn't look up immediately. I wanted him to feel the silence first. Then I turned and replied with the calmest, coldest smile I could manage. "Thank you, Dylan." It's always refreshing to hear career advice from someone who thinks an engineering degree is something you can download. Wait a minute. I just realized most people will listen and leave. But if you're not like most, you'll leave your mark in the comments and know when to subscribe. The button's there. Now, back to my story. He blinked slow, confused before laughing a little too loudly, clearly unsure if he'd just been insulted. Before he could recover, 2 visiting clients stepped inside for their scheduled walkthrough. Perfect timing for him to embarrass himself. I lifted my badge to the access panel, ready to lead them in. The scanner flashed red, then again, and again, behind me. The clients exchanged awkward glances. Dylan's grin widened. "Huh," he said, feigning innocence with all the grace of a toddler holding a broken vase. "Maybe the system finally realized it doesn't need you." I didn't reply. Instead, I walked past him slow, deliberate toward the main console. If there was a joke here, I wanted to see its punchline myself. The moment the server logs loaded, the room seemed to exhale. 3 words blinked in unforgiving white on black critical certification holder removed. I let out a quiet, humorless breath. Dylan thought he'd just bruised my ego. He had no idea he'd pulled the first brick out of a very delicate wall, and the cracks had already started. By the time the system began its countdown, the shock had already settled into a strange, almost weightless calm. A sharp tone echoed through the operations center, followed by a line of text sweeping across every monitor: mandatory safety freeze, 5 o'clock. At first, I thought it was a sync glitch. Then the timer dropped to 4 minutes 59, and the room collectively stopped breathing. I stood there in the cold wash of LED light, processing the absurdity of what had just happened. A safety freeze only triggered when the system detected the removal of a certified operator, and in our entire 22-state logistics network. There was exactly 1 person with the federal credentials required to keep everything running. That unfortunate soul happened to be me. My name is Jonathan Boyd, 46 years old, lead federal compliant infrastructure specialist. In plain English, I'm the person the federal regulators call when something goes wrong, and the person the company calls when they want to make sure nothing ever does. I designed most of our safety protocols, negotiated directly with the agencies that governed our network, and carried the certification they repeatedly reminded the executives they must never, under any circumstances, compromise. I was, in their words, not mine, the last person they could afford to lose. So of course, I was the first one Dylan deleted. The countdown dropped to 4 minutes 20, casting a rhythmic glow across the consoles. Chairs scraped, footsteps quickened, people whispered my name like I had died 5 minutes ago, and just hadn't received the announcement. Meanwhile, let the silence stretch, allowing the ridiculousness of the situation to ripen. A young engineer, barely a year into the job, hurried up beside me with panic in his eyes. "Jonathan, did you do something to the system?" "Everything's locking down." I held his gaze for a beat, neither offended nor surprised, in a room full of frantic adults. He was the only one brave enough to ask. "No," I said, keeping my voice level. "I didn't do anything." Then I leaned slightly closer, lowering my tone just enough to make the words feel heavier. But someone did, and I suspect they'll regret it long before the timer hits 0. 4 minutes remained. The engineer swallowed. Someone behind us cursed quietly, and I simply stood there, hands in my pockets, watching the countdown tick toward the inevitable. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect itself from human incompetence. Unfortunately for Dylan, it had detected plenty. So I remained where I was, breathing evenly while the room spun around me in panicked circles. The hum of the servers sounded almost amused, as if the machines themselves understood the irony unfolding. I could already imagine Dylan scrambling for excuses, for someone else to blame, for a way out. But the countdown, steady and impartial, offered none today. Most people skim this paragraph, but you don't. Right, the moment the countdown hit 0, the network obeyed with clinical precision. Screens across the operations center flickered, then shifted into a uniform slate of lockdown alerts. From Kansas to Illinois, from Ohio to the coastal hubs, every distribution lane in our 22-state network folded itself into a frozen grid. Conveyor belts halted mid-cycle, sorting arms froze mid-swing. Packages stopped dead as if the entire system had inhaled and decided not to exhale again. The room erupted instantly. Chairs toppled. Phone calls collided into the air. Someone shouted that 3 regional hubs were offline. Another cursed when the main routing board went red from corner to corner. Through all of it, I simply watched, calm, almost detached, like I'd walked into a movie I already knew the ending to. The chaos swirled around me with the predictable rhythm of people realizing they had no idea what they were doing without the system guiding them. Then came the inevitable rush. Jonathan, can you fix this? What triggered it? Please tell me this isn't permanent. It was like being the only lifeguard at a pool where everyone had decided to drown at the same time. A small crowd gathered around me, eyes wide, breaths short, waiting for a miracle. I offered them a mild smile, the kind that's polite on the surface but razor-edged beneath. I want to help, I said, pausing just long enough to let hope flare in their expressions. But unfortunately, I gestured toward the screen still displaying the message that had started it all. According to the system, I no longer exist. There was a collective blink. One engineer actually turned to the console as if expecting it to argue. Another looked at me as though I'd casually announced my own funeral. I continued with a shrug, you can't expect the network to accept help from a ghost. Federal compliance is pretty strict about that. Several nerves visibly snapped. Someone swore under their breath. Someone else muttered Dylan's name like it was a curse word they were finally allowed to use, and just as the panic seemed ready to crescendo, my computer chimed, not a system alert, not an internal message, a sound far sharper, far more serious, a federal notification. I opened the email, and the room seemed to tilt toward me. The subject line alone was enough to quiet the chaos. Immediate contact required Federal Oversight Division. The message was short, urgent, unmistakably aimed at me and only me. They wanted answers. They wanted them now. And they very much wanted to know why the only certified operator in a 22-state network had been removed at 11:05 a.m., for the first time since the freeze began. I let myself smile for real. The instant the federal email appeared on my screen, the air in the operations center shifted from frantic to feral. You could almost taste the panic, thick, metallic, clinging to every corner of the room, but no one embodied it more perfectly than Dylan Carver, who came barreling toward me like a man trying to outrun his own stupidity. Jonathan, he barked, voice cracking under the weight of his collapsing confidence. Open the system, now, that's an order. I turned slowly, savoring the moment. His face was flushed, hair slightly disheveled from what I assumed was a frantic attempt to argue with a machine that didn't care about him. The room quieted just enough for my reply to land exactly where it needed to. Of course, I said, layering my tone with the sweetest, sharpest politeness I could manage. Let me just ask, how exactly is someone who doesn't exist supposed to open anything? Several engineers stifled their reactions. One coughed, another pretended to check a monitor, but their shoulders shook in quiet amusement. Dylan, however, didn't catch the tone. Subtlety had never been one of his strengths. Stop being difficult, he snapped, trying to regain authority he'd never actually possessed. I'll do it myself. He pushed me aside and planted himself in front of the console like it owed him obedience. His fingers flew across the keys, confidence returning for a fraction of a second, right until the system rejected him with a flat, emotionless beep. Access. Denied user lacks federal certification. Dylan froze. What? That's impossible. I'm an administrator. I stepped forward just enough for him to hear the chisel hidden in my tone. Administrator isn't the same as certified. Dylan, you can delete my access, but you can't replace my credentials. The system doesn't take orders from people who don't speak its language. His eyes flicked across the screen, hoping for a loophole that wasn't there. He tried again, harder, faster, more desperate. The system rejected him a second time, then a third. Each denial beep echoed through the room like a metronome marking the rhythm of his unraveling. Then came the moment that sealed everything. A new line of text flashed across the screen. Bright and unforgiving, unauthorized access attempt, logged possible federal violation. The room collectively inhaled. Dylan's face drained of color so quickly it was almost impressive. He stumbled back a half step, staring at the words as if they might rewrite themselves out of pity. I folded my arms, letting the silence marinate. "You might want to stop now," I said gently. "Every time you try again, the system documents it. And the federal oversight team is, how should I put this, not known for their sense of humor." He looked at me, genuinely terrified for the first time that morning, and all I offered him was a calm, razor-thin smile, the kind you give right before a lesson really begins. "If you see anything unusual here, comment, 'I see it.' This paragraph explains everything you are about to hear." At 11:53 a.m., the doors slammed open with the kind of force only a panicked executive could summon. CEO Brian Carver stormed into the operations center, his suit jacket half-buttoned, his tie crooked, and his expression carved from equal parts fury, confusion, and something bordering on humiliation. He scanned the room like he expected to find the disaster neatly labeled for him. Instead, he found me standing calmly beside the console while his son hovered nearby like a guilty shadow. "Jonathan," he barked, "what the hell did you do?" "The entire network is frozen. We're getting calls from every major hub." The room went quiet, every head turning toward us. I let the accusation hang in the air for a moment, long enough for him to feel how absurd it sounded, before I lifted a single finger and pointed at the main log displayed across the central screen. "I didn't do anything," I said smoothly, "but someone under your roof clearly enjoys pressing buttons they don't understand." Brian's gaze followed my gesture. When he read the log, his face shifted, first confusion, then denial, then the creeping realization that his son might have done something so catastrophically reckless that even he couldn't spin it into competence. "Critical certification, holder removed." The screen repeated in bright, merciless letters. He turned sharply toward Dylan. "Tell me you didn't. I was just trying to clean up the system," Dylan blurted, desperation cracking through his voice. I thought he was outdated. "It was supposed to streamline access." "Streamline access," I echoed with a dry, unimpressed lift of my eyebrow. "You deleted the only federally certified operator in a 22-state infrastructure network. That's not streamlining." "Dylan, that's playing Jenga with a loaded gun." A wave of murmurs rippled through the staff. Brian's anger began boiling over, but beneath it I could see the deeper emotion he was fighting: fear. Real, career-ending fear. And that fear only sharpened when my phone buzzed sharply in my pocket, the distinctive tone reserved for federal contacts. I pulled it out without breaking eye contact. "Excuse me," I said, stepping slightly to the side. "This might be important," I answered, and the voice on the other end wasted no time. "Mr. Boyd, this is the Federal Oversight Division. We see your credential was improperly revoked. You are required to reassume operational authority immediately. Do you understand?" The entire room froze. Even Brian stopped breathing. "Yes," I said calmly. "I understand." "Good. Restoration instructions will be sent to you directly. And Mr. Boyd, we will need a full report on who initiated the removal." I hung up and looked at Brian, who now seemed smaller inside his expensive suit. The fury was still there, but buried under a thick layer of dread and humiliation he couldn't hide. "Looks like they want me back," I said quietly. "Shall we—" The call ended, but the silence it left behind was louder than anything in the room. For the first time since the freeze began, every pair of eyes shifted toward me, not with suspicion or panic anymore, but with the unmistakable recognition of someone holding all the cards. Power has a sound when it changes hands. It isn't loud. It's a quiet, collective inhale. And right then, the whole operations center was breathless. My phone buzzed again, sharp, decisive. I answered immediately. The federal officer's tone was clinical, efficient, carrying the weight of a government agency that didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Boyd, Confirming again, you are the only certified operator authorized to unlock the network. No one else in the facility has the required credentials. Understood? I glanced toward Dylan, who looked like he'd swallowed a live wire. Crystal clear, I said. The officer continued, unbothered by the unfolding meltdown in the background. Second point, the individual who revoked your credentials may have committed a violation of federal infrastructure policy. We have logged the incident and will begin preliminary review. Behind me. Dylan inhaled sharply. Not because he understood the legal implications, he didn't, but because the tone alone was enough to terrify anyone who had just triggered a federal investigation by accident. And third, the officer added, your company will likely face significant penalties for allowing unauthorized modification of certified access accounts. We will provide the details once the network is stable. I nodded slowly, letting every word settle into the air like cold ash. Understood, I replied as I ended the call. The shift in the room became almost tangible. Brian Carver, usually a man inflated with corporate confidence, looked as though someone had unplugged him. And Dylan, well, Dylan looked like a child who finally realized the stove was hot. I slipped my phone into my pocket and offered him a small, sympathetic smile, the kind that said I felt nothing of the sort. Good news, I told him lightly. There's still one person in this building who's qualified to fix this mess. Relief flickered across his face for a fraction of a second. Then I delivered the rest. Bad news. It's not you. A strangled sound escaped him, something between disbelief and embarrassment. Engineers nearby shifted uncomfortably, trying not to look amused, before Dylan could respond. My phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't a call. It was a secure message. A single line appeared on my screen. Emergency override code, issued activation, requires verified cause of access removal. I let the message linger a moment before reading it aloud. Well, I said, looks like they're giving me the keys back. But there's a catch? Brian swallowed hard. What catch? I met his eyes, voice cool and precise. The system won't let me activate the override until the reason for my removal is officially confirmed. All eyes turned to Dylan, and for the first time all morning, he had nothing left to say. There is a small change, but if you don't want to dig deeper, you don't need to pay attention. The walk to the conference room felt shorter than usual, probably because everyone cleared a path the moment I moved. Nothing sharpens office awareness like the scent of federal oversight drifting through the air by the time we stepped inside. A live video call from the Federal Oversight Division was already projected on the wall, 3 officials, each with the polite but terrifying expression of people who dealt with infrastructure failures for a living. Mr. Carver, the lead officer began, addressing the CEO with clipped formality. We require an immediate and accurate explanation for the removal of Mr. Boyd's certified access. Brian Carver straightened his jacket, trying to disguise panic as professionalism. There must have been some kind of technical error, he insisted, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Our systems have been under strain lately. Something probably misfired. The officers remained unimpressed. One of them typed something silently. Another raised an eyebrow, the kind of eyebrow that said, "Please don't waste our time." I folded my arms and leaned against the table, watching the performance with casual interest. Then Dylan stepped forward, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. I didn't do anything wrong, he said, his voice shaky but defiant. I was just cleaning the system, optimizing access. Nobody told me removing his profile would trigger a federal lockout. The room shifted annoyance, disbelief, and a ripple of suppressed amusement from the engineers in the back. Brian blinked hard, as though wishing he could rewind his son's sentence before it reached the speakers. The lead officer leaned closer to the camera. Mr. Carver, Jr., are you stating that you manually removed a federally certified operator from a critical infrastructure network? Dylan swallowed. No, I mean yes, but it wasn't like that. I thought, I repeated softly, cutting in with the sweetest sharpness I could muster, is exactly the problem here. Brian shot me a warning glare, but I ignored it. The federal officers did not. Mr. Boyd, one of them asked, can you confirm whether the removal appears intentional? I shrugged lightly. Well, we can settle that right now. My voice carried an edge of amusement as I gestured to the security console mounted in the corner. Let's just check the camera footage. The room froze. Dylan went rigid. Brian's jaw tightened until the veins in his neck surfaced. I walked over, tapped in a code, my code, the one Dylan couldn't delete because it belonged to federal compliance systems, not the company, and pulled up the feed from the operations center at 11:05 a.m. on screen. Dylan strutted into the room, bragged to two interns about showing the old guy how it's done, then very proudly deleted my profile with a dramatic flourish. Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. One of the federal officers broke it first. "Well," he said dryly, "that appears intentional." I turned back to Dylan, offering him a gentle, almost sympathetic smile. "See," I said softly. Cleaning the system, he looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. And for the first time that day, I couldn't blame him. If you don't like digging, don't go back to previous videos. The fallout began faster than any of us expected. The moment the federal officers ended the call, alerts started chiming across the room: emails, hotline messages, emergency pings from regional hubs. Word had spread. 22 states of stalled logistics were impossible to hide, and our clients didn't bother softening their tone. The first message flashed across the main screen. "Explain this immediately." The next one was worse. By the 10th, the room felt like it was trembling under the weight of corporate rage. I watched it unfold with a calm satisfaction I didn't bother disguising. After everything Dylan had stirred up, seeing the consequences march in so decisively felt almost poetic. He, meanwhile, sat in a chair he didn't remember pulling out, staring blankly at the scrolling wall of angry red notifications. His face had gone pale, the kind of pale that comes from realizing your last name won't protect you this time. Not far from him, CEO Brian Carver stood hunched over the conference table, head in his hands, shoulders heavy with the humiliation he could no longer outrun. His empire, his meticulously polished image, was cracking right in front of him. The staff whispered in corners, stepping around him the way one avoids a fallen statue with pity, curiosity, and a bit of caution. The tension in the room thickened as every new alert hit harder than the one before. Some customers threatened to suspend contracts, others demanded penalty clauses. One message from a national retailer simply read, "Fix this in the next hour or don't bother calling us again." And through it all, the system remained frozen silent, impartial, waiting for the one person who could actually bring it back: me. I let the anticipation build, feeling the slow, rising pressure draw every eye back toward me. The staff knew it, the executives knew it, even Dylan, sunk deep into his shame, knew it. The only one still pretending otherwise was Brian, who finally lifted his head just long enough to mutter, "This is a disaster." "Yes," I agreed lightly, "but a very preventable one." Before he could muster a reply, my phone buzzed again, another federal contact. I answered, and the room hushed on instinct. "Mr. Boyd," the officer said, "after reviewing the footage and preliminary findings, we cannot authorize the emergency override while the individual responsible for the removal remains involved in operations." A small pause. "Effective immediately. Dylan Carver must be suspended from all system access and removed from the operational chain, so you may proceed." Even I wasn't expecting it to be said so directly. The room snapped into silence so absolute that even the hum of the servers seemed to stop. Brian stared at me, stunned. Dylan's lips parted, but no words came out. His world, propped up by entitlement, was tilting fast. I lowered the phone slowly and met Dylan's eyes with a calm, almost gentle expression. "Well," I said softly, "looks like they've given us our next step." And for the first time that day, Dylan looked genuinely afraid. The room was still heavy with the echo of the federal officer's order when I stepped toward the main console. People pulled back instinctively, clearing a path the way one might for a surgeon moving toward an operating table. Dylan sat crumpled in his chair, suspended and silent, while Brian hovered behind him like a man aging by the minute. The tension was suffocating, but beneath it, I felt something quieter, cleaner, a sense of victory that didn't need applause to be profound. "Let's bring it back," I said softly. More to myself than anyone else, my fingers moved across the keys with the familiarity of muscle memory. Entering the emergency override sequence the federal team had issued, the system recognized me instantly, welcoming me back with a crisp confirmation tone, one that sounded suspiciously like relief. Override. Initiated restoration. Sequence commencing. A timer appeared on the screen, counting upward instead of down this time. The room leaned forward as if pulled by gravity. At 1 minute 40. The first region reconnected. At 2:10. The routing hubs flickered back online. By 3 minutes, the East Corridor pulsed green. At 3:40, the entire Midwest segment lit up. Then, at precisely 4 minutes and 32 seconds, the system released a soft chime and displayed the message everyone had been desperate to see: full operational restore, network stable. For a moment, no one moved. Then the eruption hit cheers, applause, the kind of collective relief that shakes the walls. Some people clapped my shoulder, others let out nervous laughter. A few simply slumped into their chairs, exhausted but grateful. I stayed still through it all, letting the noise wash around me like water around a stone. Quiet victories are the most satisfying ones. They don't need fireworks. Just the knowledge that every second of chaos had finally bent itself back into order beneath my hands. Across the room, Brian watched the celebration with something like awe mixed heavily with dread. Dylan didn't dare lift his eyes. I didn't bother giving him a glance. Humiliation didn't need reinforcement today. Then, amid the noise, my phone buzzed. Not the federal tone this time, something else. A private message. I stepped aside and opened it discreetly. It was from one of our largest national clients. 6 words. When you're ready, call us directly. A follow-up line appeared immediately after, we prefer working with competence, not chaos. I exhaled slowly, a subtle smile touching the corner of my mouth. The official report from the Federal Oversight Division arrived by early afternoon, stamped, signed, and mercilessly clear. The entire operations center fell silent as the conclusions were read aloud, first by a trembling compliance officer, then again by a federal representative who joined the call with the kind of stern neutrality that leaves no room for argument. First, the representative declared, Mr. Dylan Carver is now under formal federal investigation for unauthorized interference with a certified access account. A ripple of shock ran through the room. Even though everyone already knew it was coming, Dylan sank further into his chair, eyes fixed on the floor, his arrogance finally stripped clean. Second, the representative continued, the agency finds that CEO Brian Carver failed to maintain adequate oversight, resulting in a near multi-state operational collapse. Leadership accountability measures will be initiated. Brian's face drained, his jaw clenched as he absorbed the weight of the words, the kind that could follow a man for the rest of his career. And third, the representative concluded, the company is required to renegotiate and reinstate a contract with Mr. Jonathan Boyd, whose removal triggered the safety freeze. His terms, responsibilities, and compensation will be reviewed in full, effective immediately. The call ended. Silence followed, thick, heavy, unavoidable. Then Brian stepped forward, his voice usually polished. Confident came out smaller, frayed at the edges. Jonathan, please stay. We can fix this. I'll personally approve any contract revisions you want. Salary, authority, benefits, you name it. I stared at him for a long moment, not out of spite, but to let the reality settle. For years, I had watched decisions made from ego, panic, or blind ambition. Now the consequences were finally circling back, with steady calm. I offered him a polite smile and said the words that had been forming quietly inside me all day. Brian, I can save the system, I said softly, but I can't save bad leadership. He flinched, as if the sentence itself carried weight, and maybe it did. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, but it landed exactly where it needed to. I picked up my badge, still useless, still technically non-existent, and set it gently on the table. Then I walked out through the automatic doors, past rows of employees who nodded with respect, gratitude, and maybe a little awe. It was the quietest exit I'd ever made, and oddly, the most powerful. I didn't look back, but the twist came before I even reached my car. My phone buzzed another message, this time encrypted at a federal level. I opened it, expecting a follow-up to the earlier investigation. Instead, I found a direct offer from the Federal Oversight Division itself, a senior national position, oversight authority, a salary that made my old contract look like an entry-level internship, and influence across every major logistics network in the region. For a moment, I sat in the driver's seat and let the breath I'd been holding finally escape. Not triumph, but something cleaner. Vindication. I hadn't just walked away from the company. I had walked directly into a bigger future. If you've ever been pushed aside, ignored, or undervalued, let this be your reminder: stay steady, stay sharp, and let the results speak for you. Wherever you're listening from, I hope this story reached you at the right moment, if it did. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Your support keeps everything going, and I'd love to have you here for the next one.